Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely honored to be here, and I have thanks to a lot of people. I must especially thank Alice Schreier, the director of the Special Collections Research Center in Regenstein Library, and her staff, because they, among other things, brought over the display, and it was no small job. They had to pack it up and bring it over in what Alice described as a caravan. And I also thank David Pavlich very much. He's regularly helped me present this material in greater detail than I will tonight in my Chaucer classes. And I also would like to thank Barbara Bostic, who organized the photographs I've got of our University of Chicago Chaucer manuscript, and who arranged the very nice invitation, the photographs on the invitation. Well, the University of Chicago Humanists of my title, he was an expert in electronics and new things. He was out there on the cutting edge of new technology. His name was John Manley. His dates were 1865 to 1940. And the other one is Edith Rickert, and her dates were 1871 to 1938. And I'm very happy to be talking about them now, because 2010 is the 70th anniversary year of the publication of their final and greatest scholarly project, this 8-volume landmark edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And I've put only 4 volumes of the 8 on display here. I felt sorry for the caravan. Well, John Manley was brought to the University of Chicago by its first president, William Rainey Harper. He was brought here in 1898. That is 6 years after the university had been established as a PhD granting institution. And it was when it was very much out to prove itself as every bit as good or better than all those places out east. Manley had started his career as a mathematician. He'd done a master's degree in mathematics at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and then he taught mathematics for a while in college and high school. But in 1888, he went to Harvard to study philology, and he received his PhD in 1890. And apparently, instead of questioning him, one of the examiners simply handed him a cigar. Well, a year later, he was appointed as associate professor at Brown University, and he was promoted to full professor 1 year after that. Whereupon, President Harper invited him to come to the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. Manley was unenthusiastic until Harper invited him to come as full professor and as the first head of our English department. He remained head of the department until he retired in 1933, but there was a gap during World War I. This was when the cryptologist Herbert Yardley brought him into the Cryptographic Bureau of the War Department in Washington. And according to Yardley, Manley had cipher brains. And he also says that Manley developed into the most skillful and brilliant of their cryptographers. Manley was qualified for this job partly because in 1913, George Fabian, who was an eccentric millionaire living in the Chicago area, Fabian had invited him to work on what were taken to be codes in Shakespeare's plays that proved that Shakespeare was really Francis Bacon. And this I discovered, you'll be amazed, I was amazed, maybe you know this, but in 1916, Judge Richard Stanley Tuthill ruled in the Circuit Court of Cook County that Shakespeare was indeed Bacon. Manley was not to blame for that one. Well, and the University of Chicago really disapproved. Okay, now much later, I'm just jumping ahead for a moment on the cryptography thing. In 1931, Manley was working on the 15th or early 16th century Voynich manuscript. It's in Yale now. It's written in a still unbroken code. And thanks to this association, Manley got a place in Max McCoy's 1995 Indiana Jones and the Philosopher's Stone. in which he helps the FBI investigate the manuscript's theft. He goes to Princeton to enlist the services of Indiana Jones. Well, he arrived in the Department of English just in time to be present at the defense of the brilliant and beautiful Edith Rickert. There are photos of her to prove her beauty. She had grown up in LaGrange, Illinois. She'd been educated in the Chicago public school system. She graduated with an A.B. from Vassar, and then she returned to teach in Lyons Township High School in LaGrange, which I gather still exists. Okay, but while doing that, she also worked towards a PhD in English literature and philology at the new University of Chicago, and she received the degree with magna cum laude in 1899. She was the first woman to have such an honor and only the second individual in the university to have it. She went back and taught for a while in Vassar, but then she burned her academic bridges and set up as a freelance writer and researcher in London. There she published 5 novels and more than 50 short stories, translations of medieval works, and she did work in archives. She did commissioned work in the London archives. But in 1909, she came back because of a financial downturn, and she worked as an editor and trying to write till 1918, when, guess what, Manley recruited her to assist in his code-breaking activities. And the two of them were working together and were key in unscrambling the Waberski cipher. Waberski was the German spy Lothar Witzke. And in 1916, it seems he was responsible for detonating over 2 million tons of US ammunition that had been stored on Black Tom Island in New York Harbor. Anyway, he was picked up coming in from Mexico into the United States with a little bit of cipher sewn into a sleeve. And it took 3 days. Manley and Rickett decoded this, and it was basically trying to get the Mexicans in against the United States. I'm going to quote a recent person on this cryptoanalysis. He's saying, he put it this way: in a 3-day marathon of cryptoanalysis, Manley, aided by Miss Rickett, perceived the pattern of this 12-step official cipher with its multiple horizontal shiftings of 3- and 4-letter plain text groups ripped apart by a final vertical transcription. So it was a difficult one. It was a tough one. And in her diaries, Edith Rickert mentions the moment when it all sort of went click, and how glad they felt. Well, after all this wartime excitement, Rickett came back here and worked as a part-time instructor at the University of Chicago until she was officially hired into the English department as associate professor in 1924. So this would have been just after she and Manley had got together their idea about this great editorial project that they were going to do. It was one in which they were setting out to break barriers in the field of textual editing. And they were working at a time when editing was a high prestige scholarly occupation. Since then, because of easy copying techniques and changes of the way in which we think of knowledge, it's become a low prestige activity. But then it was at the top there. And they had a prestigious text to work on. They had Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It reaches us not in any text left by Chaucer himself, but only in scribal copies. There's some 83 of these, plus a couple of Caxton prints, which have equal authority with manuscripts. They're like independent witnesses. And all of these extant witnesses contain obvious copying errors and that sort of thing, and many differ from each other in complex ways in what they include. So Manley and Rickett eventually are going to establish that our earliest and most reliable witness, which is the Hengert manuscript, named after a place, that it has that it doesn't have some of the material in the manuscript that had hitherto been thought as the best manuscript, the Ellesmere manuscript, like the whole Canon's Yeoman's Prologue and Tales. So there's a question, what do you do when you've got such a lot of missing material, or was it added, that sort of thing. Or another example would be that Hengist has a rather respectable wife of Bath, whereas the Ellesmere manuscript has some lines that turn her into a more lascivious lady. And so there are masses of problems of this kind, and I've put some photos, reproductions of manuscripts on the display. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over what was involved in this enormous editorial project. When I devised the handout, I was going to spend more time on this, so forgive me for that. What I want to emphasize is that it required enormous labor. They were using a technique, an editorial technique called recension, and this involves examining every word in every witness of the text, because after all, even a late scribe might have been working with an early fragment closer to Chaucer. So it required looking at every word in all of these. In fact, that what I just said about the late scribe, it worked for the manuscript we've got here in the University of Chicago, which is a late manuscript, but which has a couple of lines in Chaucer's tale of Meleby, which are obviously missing everywhere else, except one manuscript was probably copied from our Chicago one. So it showed, I mean, they had to look at everything. And then after examining every word and recording all the variants, imagine doing that, they would take the errors and they'd work out a kind of family tree or stemma of how the manuscripts related with each other. And then they'd use this stemma to try to move back, to construct a text that was purged of all the errors that they'd seen along the way. And with the amount of evidence that they had, the idea was that this could be done very objectively. Well, the result of all this enormous labor would be a scholarly construct that, in theory at least, corresponded more closely than anything we actually have to the first scribal copy of the text, the one from which all the other copies came, ultimately. The idea is they were working on the model of printing, where you would have a copy text. So they're thinking in those terms. So they're pushing towards that. Now, some editors might think they'd got to that first scribal copy, and then they'd start putting things right that they thought that scribe had made. Okay? Or then they might think they'd got to the author, and they might even correct a few errors they thought the author had made. So it was very heady times in which to be doing editing. But Manly and Rickert were respectably restrained. They sought only to retrieve the text that came as close as humanly possible to the first scribal copy of the whole Canterbury Tales. Now, they did also plan to prepare eventually a library edition with a text that would press back to Chaucer's own text, a handy edition. And had they lived to do that, the history of Chaucer teaching would probably have been rather different from what it has been. Anyway, huge job, immense challenges, not only because there were a lot of witnesses, but they became increasingly aware that there was a very real uncertainty over whether there had ever been an original scribal copy of the Canterbury Tales. So they were uncertain about the thing they were aiming to reconstruct had ever existed. We partly know this thanks to them, but what Chaucer scholars assume is that when Chaucer died, he left a number of fragments. And that these fragments, a scribe or a number of scribes, perhaps working independently, tried to make a whole Canterbury Tales out of them as best they could. And those scribes cobbling together, well, they might have drawn on material that Chaucer had intended to cancel, say, or material that wasn't by him, or material that had belonged to earlier versions than the one he left at his death. Or the scribes could have made up material. So there were all these problems they were facing, and they weren't really clear before Manly and Rickert started their work. Well, their first task was to track down all the witnesses. So Rickett went to London, and she appealed for information about manuscripts that had been recorded in medieval wills and here, there, and everywhere, but which people had lost track of. So she put ads into the Times Literary Supplement and into Country Life. And you see who has these manuscripts in those days in England? Well, as a result of this, she eventually increased the number of known witnesses by about 10, and she established the whereabouts of quite a lot of others. And things weren't always easy, and here's a little story. Okay. During World War I, a fragment of Chaucer had been offered to Sir John Ballinger to purchase for the National Library of Wales, but, and I'm quoting, in the general confusion, it got away and was never heard of again. So Manly and Rickert, again I quote, could only grieve. I'm getting this from a letter she wrote to her students back here in Chicago. But then Ballinger had a stroke. And the opposite thing happened than you'd expect with a stroke, because the next time they went to see him, he came running towards them with outstretched hands, and he said, "You know that fragment of the nun's priest's tale that the curate named Jones of Merthyr brought to the National Library during the war? They were bound in the Latin-Welsh dictionary of 1632. So they were able to track these fragments. I've got pictures of some of them there. They, in fact, belong to a manuscript that looks as if it would have been an exceedingly good one, very close to Chaucer, but it's just fragments in that. So that's how they got that. Well, eventually, and I should say in all of this, they were helped by Sir William McCormick. He was a Scottish literary scholar. He headed the University Grants Commission in England. He was a Chaucerian. He got really involved in the project, which is finally dedicated to him. And he's the one who bought our Chaucer manuscript. He bought it so that they would have it for use in this project. So with his help, they were finally able to get photostats of every single witness to Chaucer's works. And they knew about this technology of the photostat thanks to their code-breaking activities. So as a result, we have in Regenstein photostats of every manuscript and important printed text of the Canterbury Tales. Only one manuscript of fragments has been found since they worked. But we have a lot of other stuff in Regenstein too. Now you'd think that Manly and Rickert already had plenty to get on with, but they also thought they should collect every single reference to Chaucer that occurs in the medieval records. So and a lot do, because he was customs official. Okay. So they employed professional archivists in England to help them collect these references. And they persuaded the university to buy up a huge collection of cheap manuscript material that had just come on the market. And with this, they planned to teach their graduate students how to read medieval scripts, and also the languages they'd need to know to work in the archives in England. They'd need to know Latin, French, various dialects of Middle English. And this is, in Regenstein now, it's the Bacon collection of English court and manor documents. And so Special Collections has this huge collection of manor court rolls. That is the records of the courts that do local justice. And we've got one example looking at you there, a court roll. I thought there are lots and lots of these things. So there's one there. That's the most valuable thing that's actually got over here. And it wasn't valuable when they bought it. They got the whole collection, I think, for $500. Okay, that was great in those days, even though $500 was worth something. Okay, so the Special Collections has all of that, and it has files and files bearing on the life records, some of them done by the professional archivists in London, and they've put some of that there, and some by students and people who went over. And all this stuff was put into Wiebolt 410. It's Philip de Saint's office now. It should be with the English department, but it isn't. And that was known as the Chaucer Laboratory. And this is where Manley and Rickett trained their graduate students' assistants. And this is where these assistants, they worked through all the manuscripts word by word, recording the variants. And there's a very complex system that they worked out for how to record so many variants, for so many lines, for so many manuscripts, and so on. The result, they also worked out a complex system for checking. But the result was astonishingly accurate. But things could be lively along the way. And this is why I've abandoned editing tonight, to talk to you about lively things along the way. Okay, in 1931, Manley and Rickett were busy working in England. And Mr. Hendricks, a student, and 5 or 6 women, some of whom were going to become major Chaucerians, they were holding the fort back at home. And the women had it in for Hendricks, and they wrote a letter to the acting head of the department, J.R. Hulbert, saying that Hendricks wasn't putting his hours in. Hulbert urged Hendricks to write to Manley and Rickett with his side of the story. And I'm going to quote from his letter. Okay, it's a mad letter. It's 4 pages, single-spaced. He's absolutely out of his mind. I'm not giving you much of this, but okay. He starts off by saying that it was really rather nice in the Chaucer Laboratory, until this trouble started. The laboratory had been a very gay place to be in, a kind of vaudeville house, really a burlesque show. And then he goes on. I've referred to the laboratory as a burlesque show. It is also a chatterbox. At times I've not been able to work because of the annoyance of senseless conversation. I could not sit and listen to their lascivious stories. These are typical. Miss M enters and in a loud voice says, I wonder what Lucy will say when she wakes up and finds that I wasn't at home last night. And it develops that she got home at 3 o'clock and left before Lucy had awakened that morning. Another morning, Miss M enters and calls out, think of it, Mr. Teal asked me to sit at his desk for 5 minutes. I asked him who he thought I was. Then follows a conversation in which all join, each one expressing an opinion of Mr. T. Another evening, Miss D announces that she's going to have dinner with a bachelor in his apartment. Miss M raises her loud voice louder and says, now look out, Mabel, you can't tell what will happen in a bachelor's apartment. Oh, that's nothing, Miss D replies. I lived with a married man for 4 months, and all his wife worried about was that he wouldn't have enough to eat. Another morning, just one more, okay. Another morning, Miss D has read from an old book of etiquette or manners. They all call to mind something that has been read, each one contributing to the clamour. A young lady should wash her stockings so many times per week, and her feet, and anything else. When a young lady goes out with a gentleman, and they are to sit on the grass under a tree, he is supposed to do certain things. And they add something about other matters, all adding to a general confusion. Is it any wonder that I pick up and leave with all this going on? Well, he originally planned to send it to Miss Rickert, and she said that she could tell Mr. Manley whatever she chose and that he would do other work or whatever they wanted. But then he decides to send it to Mr. Manley. Dear Mr. Manley, this is handwritten. On second thought, I've decided to send the letter to you instead of to Miss Rickert, who may become too excited about it and have her health affected. I'm sorry, of course, to have to trouble you with it. Okay, her health was not good at the time, so there may have been a real worry, but somehow at the end of that letter, that's really something. Okay. Well, Hulbert, his conclusion about all this was that continuous work of the minute character that the students were doing gets on people's nerves and makes them abnormal, and that men should not be employed on the Chaucer staff. Manley simply wrote back to the whole staff saying, you've behaved as naughty children when the nurse is away, and everything seems to have calmed down. Well, there was, of course, a program that required funding. Things originally promised well. The Rockefeller Foundation talked of giving them an annual budget of $50,000 for 5 years, and 5 years complete leave for the two of them. So that was the initial promise. But it finally came through, when the money came through, the annual budget was $23,000 with no assurance of continuity, and Manley and Rickett had to teach for half the year. That's for 2 quarters. That's our full-time load. And also from 1929, the university administration, which was now headed by the 5th president of the university, Robert Hutchins, it began pressuring them to finish within the originally estimated 5 years, despite all the teaching. Now, from the first, Manley had worried about Hutchins, and I'm going to quote a letter he wrote to David Stevens, who was assistant to the previous president, Max Mason. I'm somewhat troubled about what you say of Hutchins. I saw too little of him in the autumn to be able to guess his plans or his policy. The most disturbing incident to me personally was his query whether we couldn't make the Chaucer text without taking up all the subsidiary investigations, that is the life records, on which we are spending time and money. Of course, I told him we could, but that in the first place, if we did neglect them, someone else would come along and do them better and make a better text than ours. Well, Manley's logic may not be great in that final sentence, but in wanting to ditch the life records, Hutchins was being very short-sighted. As in the long run, the life records, which were finally published, I have them over there, they were published in 1966 by 2 of Manley and Rickert's students, and they've proved a really major contribution to scholarship. Well, the edition came out in 1940. I'm not going to describe it now. That's another thing I've just abandoned for the sake of time. But what I want to say is that it stunned scholars when it came out. I'm quoting Kent Malone of Johns Hopkins. History will know it as a landmark of American literary scholarship. And there was a review in the Times Literary Supplement in 1940, June, under the heading, Heroism in Scholarship. It's concurring. Prodigious. The great merit of this vast accomplishment does not consist merely in the fact that it makes possible a better text of the Canterbury Tales than any which has hitherto been published. It marks an epoch in the development of the art of editing a classical text from a large number of manuscripts. But it literally killed its editors. This, at least, is the hagiography. Rickett had worked absolutely non-stop on it for years, and in 1931 she had a breakdown. She was then off and on unwell. She kept working, of course, but she had a heart attack in 1936 that left her bedridden. Even so, she worked as much as she could. 2 days before her death of a stroke in 1938, she handed Manley a paper on which she'd written her thoughts about what she thought were some important early Chaucer trays, things that had come through from early Chaucer drafts in a manuscript in Cambridge. And Manley didn't buy what she said, and he's clear about that, but he did publish this material in the end of the volume 2 of the edition. And she died the 2 days after handing these over. And then less than 3 months after the publication of the edition and before the appearance of most of its reviews, including the Times Literary Supplement one that I just read, Manley died of a heart attack. He had had bad health for some years. And his portrait by William Orpen, it looks at us as we walk into the English department. Orpen was the most important portrait painter of the day and very, very expensive. He charged $15,000 to make a portrait, but Rickett had managed to make friends with him. And so the university got it in return for a little gift. And now Orpen's paintings are exceedingly valuable. An unsigned one that was established to be his was estimated at £250,000 on a recent Antiques Roadshow in England. And ours is signed. Okay, well, the edition, despite all the lively goings-on in the Chaucer Laboratory, was incredibly accurate. But it didn't have the impact it deserved For one thing, World War II intervened, and for another, Manley and Rickert's results are disconcertingly complicated. It's partly because they were doing a kind of project where you have to get to the end almost before you can begin it, before you can lay it out, and they're being pushed for time all the time. They had to publish their text before they got all the variants in order. It was a very hard job for them. They were able to use photo offset, though, which meant that the edition was less expensive than it might otherwise have been. They didn't, of course, live to produce the projected library edition that would have concisely borne witness to their work. So scholars have never picked up on their text for everyday teaching. Instead, a one-volume edition of Chaucer's works that came out in 1933 from Yale by F.N. Robinson has dominated the market. Okay, he's a real slacker as an editor. Okay. Not nearly such a good text. Oh, okay. Well, Manley and Rickett have also come in for longer-term criticism, and some of this is valid. This decision that they had to make midway, that they couldn't get a single scribal archetype, this copy text, they realized this sort of midway. They were extremely honest about it, and they said, well, under the circumstances, they had to proceed as if there were such an archetype. But this let a methodological inconsistency into the edition, which they never had time to revise out, and this opened them to severe criticism. And in particular, George Kane of London University, later University of North Carolina, in 1984, he produced an astonishingly ungenerous account of their work. It's amazing. It's one of the most nasty things that I've read. He was an editor using a different method, so there may have been other things in it for him. It has been quite influential, but it inspired Roy Vance Ramsey, who in his obituary was termed defender of the underdog, to spend 16 years and 713 pages, it's over there, defending Manley and Rickert's edition. And I'm not the only one to think that he did this satisfactorily. There's been meetings of the Medieval Academy and that sort of thing on this. Well, criticism or no criticism, all scholars have acknowledged the validity of many of Manley and Rickert's findings. Many. But one important one was that they recognized that the Hengert manuscript is normally textually superior to anything else we have. And as a result, Robinson's edition, that Yale thing, has increasingly been corrected in the direction of Hengert. And Hengert has also been used by the editors of the Variorum Chaucer. This aims to record the scholarly history of the Canterbury Tales. They're using a version of Hengert. They also took all Manley and Rickert's collation cards for this. And now we have one more project, the Canterbury Tales project. It's to be executed, its officers hope, in close collaboration with Regenstein Library, and it aims to make available all manuscripts and various later editions of the Canterbury Tales in electronic form. And it's going to do this in part by reconstructing the witnesses' texts out of Manley and Rickert's lists of variant readings. So they're going to be putting electronically all that raw data that Manley and Rickett had analysed through their heads. So they're undoing all that so we can reanalyze it. Oh, well, okay. Anyway, it's a great project, and it really looks beautiful, the bits they've done on when you go into them on the internet. Well, my last words are going to come from people who wrote to Manley about the edition just before he died. I quote first Martin Ruud, R-U-U-D. He had been a student here, and he was a Scandinavianist. I think he was teaching at Madison. He writes, "It has made me feel very humble and very proud, humble in the realization of what great scholarship is, and proud to have known you. It makes me proud, too, of the University of Chicago and of my country, for work like this gives us the right to hold up our heads." And here's R.S. Crane writing from within the English department. "The book, as I think of it, is a symbol of the kind of scholarship, at once rich in detail and closely reasoned, which you have made the tradition of this department and which, in however diverse or new forms, is, and I hope will continue to be, the ideal of us all. Only by daring to do new things and trying always to do them in the most workmanlike way can we expect to justify our presence at the University of Chicago, which for me at least will always be the University of Manly. Thank you. I've been asked if I'll answer questions, and if I can maneuver all this electronic stuff, I'll give it. Yes.
Could you explain for us, in a large sense, what the notion of a witness is?
Oh.
What does witness mean?
It's an extant example of the text. So a manuscript containing Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a witness to the Canterbury Tales. It's as simple as that. I use the term witness rather than manuscripts or medieval manuscripts because I have to include some printed texts for this. But it's a general term for a work that you're going to look at when trying to reach a text that approximates as closely as possible to Chaucer's own.
So is the magic number 83?
The magic number of manuscripts is that, yes. Some of them, are about 56 or something, are of what we assume were complete Canterbury Tales, and others are of bits of the Canterbury Tales. And then we've got a couple, these Caxton prints. Caxton's first printing, we know, was from a manuscript we no longer have. And his second printing, which he took off that, he corrected from yet another manuscript that we no longer have, but it seems to be in a very good manuscript. So you have to unravel all of that. So you have to take his printed texts also into account when trying to get back to Chaucer. At a certain point, you could stop worrying because the printed texts are going to be working from material you already have. So the cutoff is about 1500 when thinking about how to get back to Chaucer's text. Does that answer it? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be using jargon. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, of course, biologists have been doing this sort of genealogical analysis long before there were any biological geneticists. Yes. But there now are biological geneticists who have very powerful computer
Yes.
tools that have been
Yes.
developed for DNA mutation analysis
Yes.
and so on. Given that there will be this digital form of all of the records that
Yes.
Manly and Rickert came up with, are there plans to apply this type
Yes.
of...
Yes, this is why I would be quite unable to work on this Canterbury Tales project that they've got going. But they have already published in places like Nature diagrams of where the manuscripts fall using these techniques. However, I was very upset. I was looking at this, and they left out Ellesmere, and I wanted to see where they would put it. But they forgot it in Nature. But I've got, actually, I may have left it in my office, but there are these diagrams. You could, if you Google Canterbury Tales, Nature, you're probably going to come up with a picture. Yeah, but they are doing that. So it's all this has left any realm that I can deal with. Manly and Rickert would have been able to deal with it. They had the minds that could deal with any new breakthrough thing like that. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, just a couple of quick questions. One, have you examined I think it's the J. Point Morgan Library, the Caxton Chaucer Tales? I think Morgan has it. They're in that library.
I've never looked at the one in the Morgan Library. No.
And the second one is, how would Chaucer handled that letter that you're quoting from?
How would Chaucer have handled these young people? He would have turned it into a fablio. It would have been, it would have been a Miller's Tale. He would have loved it. Isn't it great? Yeah, he would. It should have been among his papers. We would have known that he was planning a fablio around it. At the back, yes.
Yeah. So what did Manly and Rickert conclude about the wife of man? Was she the lascivious woman I read about in school?
That's a good question. And because I went so fast, they worked on the assumption that, say, in the Ellesmere manuscript, where these editions are, that these had come through from either earlier drafts or from more complete material that had been brought together after the Hengert scribe worked. So they treated much of this additional material as Chaucerian. Now, editors recently who've been absolute hard Hengert nuts have done editions that have none of it, and it makes for a rather different looking text. But Manley and Rickert, they wanted. Look, I keep thinking, if I'm describing this to my students, I say these guys were really cool. And they would have wanted, I think, a slightly lascivious wife of Bath. Yes, next.
Am I correct in remembering that the relationship between them was not really professional?
There was a rumor. The rumor among medievalists was that they were romantically involved. They were certainly an extremely close intellectual friendship, lasting from that World War I time till their deaths. His tribute to her in the edition and in his papers, she was as something and sweet as she was strong. I mean, this is a person who really they loved each other. There's no doubt. If they had a romantic relationship, they were very circumspect. There's not anything in the archives that would uncover much of that. They had to be for her career. They would have had to be. But the novel I've put there, which she published, it was the year she became full professor, it's about a young girl who's really weighing the pros and cons of marriage and who's against marriage, who comes out against, I would say, in that book. Also, I found in the archives that during that World War I period, she published a poem, and it was Manly who sent it out anonymously for her, about a young man who had died in the war, and his name was Ned, and there is a Ned who turns up in her diaries as someone she knew. So maybe there was someone who'd been killed in the war. She and Manly certainly had a very sustaining relationship. They were quite old. I don't want to push this too hard. If they took stuff out of the archive, it's none of my business. You know, these were exceedingly nice people. I'm so fond of them after reading their stuff. I'm sorry, yes.
An 8-volume book must have been expensive. Did it sell well? Who bought it?
Okay, well, as I said, it was photo offset, so the University of Chicago Press was able to bring it out more cheaply than otherwise. In fact, Manley hoped that it would be inexpensive enough that even students could own it. I don't know how well it sold, but of course all libraries would have had to get it. I mean, it's an absolute essential thing, and it was much less expensive than it might have been with different technology. So the reviewers and people all sort of say, hooray, hooray. It looks odd to start with, but it's great. And I can't tell you what the sales were at that point. There was all the business of the war and everything else to complicate things. Oh, Chaucer would like this. Oh, yeah, there's another question, because I think people want to go and drink. I was going to say Chaucer would like this, but okay, quick. Yeah.
The university archives here at Rickert House at Woodward Court, which was torn down. There was the house, I think, named for the Rickert House.
Yes, yes.
And now, of course, that's disappeared. So
it's so sad. She was so beautiful. I've got a nice digital picture of her now, which I'm thinking of getting framed and putting up in the department. She's really something. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Nolcken. It is the tradition of the Library Society to present to the collections a volume to honor our speaker and an appreciation. And we have selected Chaucer, Contemporary Approaches, edited by Susanna Fine, David Raven, Pennsylvania State University Press, 2010. It has been added to the collection in honor of Christina von Nolcken on the occasion of her talk to the University of Chicago Library Society, 2 University of Chicago Humanists, and a landmark edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
Can I just say, thank you. Susanna Fine was a student here. She did her MA here, and she's a friend of mine. That's so good. Thank you. That's great.